gathering up information on how ONO came to be. I used William Egley's History of Dauphin and Lebanon Counties that was published in 1883 because he gives a little overview of how the little villages and boroughs in Lebanon County had their beginnings. I learned that the ONO was never a regularly laid out village as some others like Jonestown and Fredericksburg were. It kind of grew like Topsy. It had its beginnings in the middle of the 19th century, around 1850. The land that the village is built on was owned by three gentlemen for the most part. Joseph Walter, John Seltzer, and Dr. D.S. Cooper. We're told that the first house was built by a man called Frederick Sager. Egley says it was in 1848 when the house was built, but Dr. Hiram Shank, who also wrote a history of the Lebanon Valley, published later in 1930, says that first house was built in 1846. I haven't been able to determine which one is correct, if for that matter, if either of them is. I'd have to go to the courthouse and do some research on deeds. But anyway, it was in that time period that ONO had its beginning. It was named Mount Nebo by Judge William Rank and Dr. Cooper. Mostly, I'm told, because the village is built on a rather elevated hill. This name is scriptural. You can read that name in the Old Testament several times. The post office was established in 1851, and John Seltzer was appointed the postmaster. The postal department called the village Seltzerville. Then a year or two later, when Milton Cooper was appointed postmaster, the name of the office had to be changed because there was a Mount Nebo in Lancaster County. And there was some discussion over that. There's a legend that says people couldn't agree. They always came up with a response when a name was suggested. Oh no, that's how it got its name. I'm not sure how much that's fact rather than fiction. But we're told by Egley in his history that the name ONO was chosen by Dr. Cooper again and Judge Rank. The name ONO, which is also scriptural, it's a Bible name that you can find in the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. And anyway, that's the name that has been used ever since. Mount Nebo was a name that was used by a lot of people for a long time, but ONO was the official name of the village. ONO has had four different church buildings. The first one was the Mount Nebo Union Church. It was a little brick building that was built in 1850. There were several denominations that used this building for worship. Among them were the Evangelical Association and the United Brethren in Christ, and a whole group of others too. The building is still standing today, and it's owned privately, and it's being used as a garage. Vinyl siding covers the three sides of the building. If you want to see the original brick structure, you have to go to the back of the building. That's still there. In 1870, the Evangelical Association built the Salem Chapel, a two-story frame building at the east end of the village, and that building was torn down in the late 1960s after the merger of the Salem congregation with the Memorial congregation in 1965. The United Brethren in Christ congregation built their building at the west end of the village in 1915, and it was named Memorial United Brethren Church to honor the memory of George Bainey, who was instrumental in its construction. After the merger of the Salem and Memorial congregations in 1965, the new church was known as the ONO United Methodist Church, and the old memorial building was razed and a new building was erected in 1970. Today, that's the only remaining church building that's in use in the village. ONO has had a number of physicians besides Dr. Cooper. Dr. Cooper was the first one. He came there in 1839, before there was even a town that had started to be built, and he practiced for over 30 years. He was prominent in establishing the Lebanon County Medical Society, and when he retired, he moved into Jonestown. Other doctors that followed him were Dr. John Zorg, Dr. William Henderson, Dr. Kreider, Dr. Grumbine, Dr. Lesler, Dr. William Holtzberg, Dr. A.S. Ryder, and Dr. A.L. Hauer. I was really surprised to learn that there were that many doctors that had located themselves there in that little village of Ono. Ono, of course, is located along a highway from Harrisburg to Allentown and on to New York City. We knew it at one time as Route 22, and then for a time it became Old Route 22, but today it's just Jonestown Road. There were a number of hotels and taverns located in the village because in those early days a lot of people traveled by horseback and carriage, and they needed a place to stay. Milton Cooper was the builder of the Buck Hotel in 1869 there in Ono. And that's interesting too, because there's a Buck Hotel in Jonestown that's been around for a long time, even longer than this. And J.B. Bixler had a hotel in 1875. There was another one that's still standing today and is used as a house or a home. That was the J.W. Meese Hotel. He took over that place in 1914. And a Morris Fox had a hotel that was known as the American House in 1869. There were a lot of general stores over the years. Egley says the first store was opened by Jacob Seltzer and he was succeeded as in the storekeeper business by John Seltzer. I'm not sure if he was a son or a brother. Other merchants in those early days were Henry Malfier and J.J. Gossett and Nathan Shirk, and then there was Elmer Shuey. He had a general store starting in 1895. He also had a huckster route where he traveled around the countryside in an old truck and sold grocery items. Anson Wentling was another storekeeper. His store was mostly a hardware store. There were a lot of blacksmiths and wheelwright. There was a wheelwright shop in Ono. Egley says that Jacob Stauffer was the first blacksmith and that his shop was at his tavern. Alexander Hentrick and Thomas Albert and Harvey Albert. Now, Brian, here's where your family comes in. Harvey would have been your great-grandfather?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. He had the blacksmith shop for many years, located right along Main Street there, next to the Snavely House. Wheelwright shop was run by Jake Killinger. Benjamin Pfeiffer was another wheelwright. Saved one of the boards from the old wheelwright shop when they tore it down just a couple years ago. And I have a thermometer mounted on it in my basement. The road through the village was a dirt road until the 1920s when the concrete roadway was constructed. Increasingly, the horse and the wagon gave way to the automobile and the truck. Gas stations and garages appeared. There was one at the west end of town in my lifetime that was owned and operated by Ezra Meyer. Before him, Ira Kreider had it, and he had a Ford dealership there. Robert Shuey had the one in the center of town, and he had a farm implement business, and he also sold Chevrolet vehicles. Telephone came to ONO in the early 1920s, or the early 20th century, I should say. If you can get a hold of a 1914 farm and business directory of Lebanon County, I was able to get one at an auction. There you'll find listed the ONO and Lebanon Rural Telephone Company. When I was a boy, the switchboard for the telephone was located in the house right on the corner where Lincoln Road goes north, and Helen Wintling was the operator. We used to stand on the porch and look in through the window and watch her pull the cords and plug them into the right holes. That was when you had the telephone that you had to crank to get the operator. Last one of those that I remember in use was owned by the Kreiser family, who lived next door to us when I was growing up, and they were able to get a hold of a few of those old phones, and they hooked one up in the house and one down in the outhouse, and when the kids didn't show up to wash the dishes, the phone would ring down there, and they got to hurry up, call to get up there and do the dishes. During World War II, ONO, of course, was located close to Indiantown Gap, and I can remember well the troops would march through ONO on their practice drills, and they even had mock battles around the area, down in McGillstown and sometimes in the outskirts of ONO there. And I even remember when they had a cavalry detachment back there, and the horses would come through ONO. During that time, the Oh Yes Hotel was built down at the west, about half a mile to the west of the village, and that became a very popular spot, especially during World War II and immediately after. It even made Ripley's Believe It or Not, because of the fact that the names were opposite. Of course, the Oh Yes Hotel in the town of ONO. The last Oh Yes business that we had was the store that was back there at the Dunmoyer property, and that's no longer in business either. None of the country stores that were in existence are around anymore either. They gave way to the big supermarkets and the larger concerns. A lot of the young men left the village to serve our country during World War II. One of them was actually killed during the war. That was Ralph Sherman. Route 22 was built in the late 40s when I was in the Lincoln Elementary School, and that changed things considerably. The businesses like the tourist cabins and those things that were built along old Route 22 on the west and east side of ONO disappeared, and all of them moved over to new Route 22. Big business that was in ONO was owned and operated by J.P. Dunmoyer, Jonas Dunmoyer, down at the east end, and he moved back to the new highway also. And his trucking business is a big concern there today. And he also built the ONO Diner, and that was in operation for a long time. From the very beginning, of course, ONO was surrounded by farms, and farming was for many years the main occupation of the residents of the area. But in the village there have been a lot of other industries that were carried out by the people living there. A lot of the homes were used by people who left the farm and retired. There were blacksmiths, there were wheelwrights, merchants, leather dealers, saddlers, weavers, tailors, hotel keepers. Even a jeweler at one time had a business there in ONO. There was an undertaker. There were potters. There was a big pottery down at the east end of town where the nursery is today. They made utilitarian items like crops and things to keep food in. There were tinsmiths. There were cattle dealers, there were hucksters, there was a well driller at one time, and a cider press operator. That was a big operation. My dad often talked about how the trucks would be lined up all the way through town with apples to be pressed into cider. That was operated by the Emmerichs. Grant Emmerich was quite a mechanic. He came up with all kinds of ideas, and he's the one who built the well drilling outfit too. There were garment factories in ONO where the women could find employment. There was a big wagon making factory. J.H. Meese read a paper in 1901 to the Lebanon County Historical Society at their annual banquet, where he said, quote, "At Mount Nebo were 2 large carriage works employing quite a number of men." And then he went on to say that the wagons that were built there were used to haul charcoal to the iron furnace at Cornwall. There's a large cemetery at the west end of ONO. There are some people buried there that are of note. John Walter was one. He was very instrumental in the organization and beginning of the evangelical church. Wrote the first hymn book for the church. And there's even a former Negro slave buried there in that cemetery. It is said that he was a slave that belonged to Thomas Jefferson at one point. And how he got here to Lebanon County and ONO, I don't know the details. It would be interesting to know, I'm sure. There was a creamery, or several creameries at one point in ONO, where farmers brought their milk. Today, the largest industry that goes on in ONO is the one J.P. Dunmoyer Incorporated, the big trucking concern. ONO Industries is still there. They make plastic extrusions. Lincoln School was the place where most of the children got their education in ONO. The land on which the school stands was purchased from Dr. Cooper, one of the original settlers there in that area, and purchased from him and his wife Mary Ann in 1866. The purchase price for that land was $37. The Lincoln School appears on the F.A. Davis map of Lebanon County in 1875. So it was probably built somewhere between those two times, 1866 and 1875. But we know it also that the first Lincoln School was burned down, and another one replaced it, the one that's there now. That's being used. Is that a plumbing concern that has it now?
Yes, heating and plumbing.
And so it still stands. The school closed its doors for the last time in 1958. There was a POS of A, Patriotic Order Sons of America Lodge in ONO for a number of years. That was right there in the center of town. That no longer stands either. Most of the houses that make up the main part of the village were built between those early times in the middle of the 19th century and 1900, in that 50-year period. Then there was other construction that occurred mostly after World War II. Houses were built along Lincoln School Road, and to the west of the town, new houses appeared, and but basically the town hasn't changed all that much in as far as its appearance is concerned. I'd like to close my remarks with a poem that was written by someone that most of you know. For many of you, she was a teacher that probably were in her classes at the Jonestown and Northern Lebanon High School. I'm talking about Lottie Snavely. Lottie wrote this poem called Reminiscence of Mount Nebo. Often I think of that little town that is seated on top of a hill. Often in thoughts go up and down the tree-lined street of that dear old town, and my youth comes back to me. I can see the shadowy line of its trees and catch in the space between the leaves the waves of the golden fields of grain, and the rustling corn in rows on the leaves, and my youth comes back to me. I remember the old post office sign, how it hung o'er the door of the country store, the boxes and the nail kegs all in a row, where country philosophers sat in repose, and aimed for the spittoon by the pot-bellied stove. I remember the weather-beaten blacksmith shop with its wide o'erhanging roof at the door, the ring of the anvil and the roar of the forge, the rows of horseshoes hanging overhead, and the stamp of the horses and mules being shod. I remember the wheelwright's little red shop where at the dawn could be heard both saw and plane, with its heap of curled shavings of the fragrant pine, its long carpenter bench and little wood stove, its high schoolmaster's desk with its well-worn store of books, both religious and of powwow lore. I remember the crockery, long and dark, its clappered sides and broken shards, its potter's wheels and row on row of shelves on which reposed all manner of both sleek and misshapen crocks. I can also see the tinsmith shop with its store of household goods for sale, stoves, tubs, buckets of all degrees, knives, forks, spoons, and schmear case machines, candle molds, candlesticks, and oil lanterns hanging from the beams. I remember the general country store. By its door stood the odorous sumac tree. The dim, cool room with the mingled smell of ground coffee, spices, cheese, and kerosene too. The molasses and cracker barrels, rock candy jars, and well-filled shelves of dishes and bolts of calico new. I remember the little red one-room school where studying was still the general rule. The battered seats and the master's desk with its knee-hole for the culprit's penance. The large hand bell that called us from play, and the small tap bell for classes to pass. I remember the blue rock and the shady lane where all young and old for recreation went. The clear rippling brook where the mint and watercress grew. The flat boats with their hand-turned coal screens. The rowboats, the old swimming hole and the spring by the path where hung for us a rough brown coconut hat. I remember the lodge hall with its box-like front where none but those who could whisper the password went, where flags, muskets, and regalia bright and other mementos of bygone days were brought from their cases for Memorial Day's celebration. I can see the little red brick Union Church with its marble plaque giving the former name of the town, Mount Nebo Union Church, a silent reminder of our deeply religious heritage. Nebo, from which Moses viewed the promised land from Dan to Beersheba, or Ono, the Benjamite city where Nehemiah was to meet Sanballat, the fierce chief of Moab who tried to deter the rebuilding of the Jerusalem walls. I remember the church bell in its steeple tall, how gaily it rang on a Sabbath day and called us all to church, or slowly told and spread the sad news of someone who had gone. How slowly we counted and tried to surmise who it might be that had passed to the eternal beyond. These are the things in my mind's eye I see as I visit the town of my youth. Gone are the horse and chestnut trees, the hitching posts on which the children would swing. Gone are the water pumps along the tree-lined street. Gone are the clouds of thick yellow dust as droves of horses and large herds of cows ambled slowly down the street. Gone is the tavern and the row of chairs for those who would linger there. Gone are the faces of many whom I knew so well. But as I visit the old town again, with a joy that is almost pain, my heart goes back to wonder there, among the dreams of the days that were, I find my lost youth again. Thank you for having